St. John's, Newfoundland, December 1981. If you've never been there, here's what you need to understand. This wasn't a big city with strangers passing each other on subway platforms. St. John's had roughly 100,000 people. An isolated island community where trust wasn't a choice, it was the baseline of survival. You relied on the person next to you because the Atlantic Ocean made sure you had no other option. And that trust had never been broken. Not like this, not with a child. People in St. John's didn't think twice about their kids walking alone after dark. Violence, real violence, the kind that takes a life, felt like something that happened somewhere else. On the news, in another province, to other people's families. That belief was about to be shattered. Permanently. Dana Nicole Bradley was 14 years old. She was in 9th grade at I.J. Sampson Junior High School, and by every account from everyone who knew her, she was the kind of kid people remember. Not because of anything dramatic, because of the ordinary warmth she carried into every room she walked into. Her principal remembered her vividly years later. Smart, applied herself, good grades. But what stood out wasn't academic. It was how she made people feel. She laughed easily. She had time for people. Big blue eyes. A smile that pulled you in whether you were ready or not. She loved art. Passionately. Completely. The way only teenagers can love something. Without self-consciousness, without wondering if it's practical. She had a stepfather, Jeff Levitz, who used to let her pretend to steer his boat when she was small. It was a home built on ordinary, quiet affection. The kind of safety that makes a 14-year-old believe the world outside is just as kind. December 14th, 1981, was her mother Dawn's birthday. Dana wasn't supposed to be out for long. She had a reason to come home that night that had nothing to do with rules or curfews. Her family was waiting. Her mother's birthday was waiting. She was a 14-year-old who still cared about that. After school, she met her friends at a nearby convenience store. Then they all walked together to her friend Penny Cobbs's house on Curry Place, just off Topsail Road. 2 hours of normal. Talking, laughing, nothing that looked like a last afternoon. At some point, Dana picked up the phone and called home. Her mother or grandmother answered. Dana told them she was heading to the bus stop. She'd be home by 5:30. That was the last time anyone in her family heard her voice. She picked up her school books. She said goodbye to her friends. She walked out the door. The bus stop on Topsail Road was 450 meters away, a 5-minute walk, a busy street, the kind of distance that requires no courage at all. She had bus fare in her pocket. The bus stop was just minutes away, yet as she walked along the shoulder of Topsail Road, she put her thumb out. In St. John's, in 1981, hitchhiking wasn't a risk. It was just a faster way to get home to your mother's birthday. That decision, made in 5 seconds on a cold December evening, is the reason we're here today. Harry and John Smeaton were brothers, working at a Christmas tree lot directly behind the bus stop on Topsail Road. December 14th was busy. Christmas was 10 days out, so they'd taken a short break in their truck, watching the street. That's when they saw her. A young girl walking along Topsail Road, thumb out, heading toward the stop. Harry noticed her age. Young, he thought. He and his brother exchanged a comment about it. Not alarmed, just noticing. Then a car slowed down beside her. The car was a faded, rusty 4-door sedan. It ran slow and rough, the engine grinding against the December cold. Common. Forgettable. Except for one detail the Smeaton brothers would never forget. The passenger door wouldn't open from the outside. Dana reached for the handle. Nothing. And then, the man behind the wheel leaned across the vinyl seat and pushed the door open from inside. The Smeaton brothers watched the silhouette of his face move through the glass. They were close enough. Close enough that when police came to them days later, that face would become a composite sketch, the kind that ends up on the front page of every newspaper in the province. Dana stepped back to let the door swing open. She got in. The rusty door slammed shut, and with that single click, she vanished. 2 men watched the car pull away down Topsail Road. They didn't follow it. Why would they? It was a girl getting a lift home. It happened every day. That was the last time anyone saw Dana Bradley alive. 5:30 came and went. Jeff Levitz would later describe himself as an eternal optimist, the kind of man who always reaches for the reasonable explanation first. The bus was late. She ran into someone she knew. She lost track of time. But somewhere underneath that optimism, something else was forming. Because Dana wasn't that kind of kid. She had called ahead. She had given a time. She was coming home. And the evening was already planned around her arrival. The phone calls started. Friends, neighbors, anyone who might know where she was. Each call came back empty. When they went to the police that night, they were told what families are almost always told: we can't file a missing report for 24 hours. She'll probably turn up. The family went home. They sat together in a house that had gone quiet in the wrong way. Outside, December cold pressed against the windows. They waited for a knock on the door. But what came 4 days later was far worse than silence. When Dana's body was found, the way it was arranged told investigators something deeply disturbing about who they were looking for. But before we get there, we need to talk about those 4 days in between. December 15th, December 16th, December 17th. 3 days where a whole province held its breath and tried to convince itself that a 14-year-old girl was still alive somewhere. The news spread the way news spreads in a small city, fast and person to person. By the morning after Dana disappeared, her face was on the front page of every newspaper in St. John's. Radio stations were running her description between songs. Schools were talking about it. Workplaces were talking about it. Everywhere, the same name, the same photograph, the same question. Where is Dana Bradley? Parents who had never thought twice about their kids walking home from school were now standing at their front windows watching, locking doors that hadn't been locked in years. The instinct was immediate. Pull your children close, because something is out there. Police were moving. Within the first weeks alone, over 800 cars matching witness descriptions were tracked down and their owners questioned. A joint task force of 35 full-time investigators from both the RCMP and the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, the largest criminal operation this province had ever assembled for a single case. And still, for 4 days, nothing. December 18th, 1981. Dale Smith had no idea what that morning was going to become. He loaded his wife and 2 kids into the car with a simple plan. They were going to find their own Christmas tree, not from a lot, a real one, cut from the woods. They drove out to a remote wooded area off Maddox Cove Road, south of the city. Isolated, no houses nearby, no noise, just trees and snow and the particular silence that comes when a place is very far from everything. He parked and noticed footprints in the fresh snow. Someone had been here recently. He moved his family deeper into the trees, away from the prints. That's when he saw something through the branches, a shape on the ground, partially hidden by undergrowth, partially swallowed by shadow. His mind reached for the only explanation that made sense, that someone had dumped an old storefront mannequin in the brush. It was the only thought his mind could handle. He took a step closer. He looked at his wife. The realization didn't come with a scream. It came with a sudden, freezing silence. It wasn't a mannequin. Dale turned sharply, told his children to stay inside the car, and ran for help. When officers arrived at that clearing off Maddox Cove Road, they found Dana Bradley. She was wearing her school clothes. Every piece of clothing she had left the house in 4 days earlier. All of it still on her, arranged. Her school books were tucked carefully under one arm, pressed against her body as though she was walking down a hallway between classes. Her face had been cleaned, not disturbed, not left the way violence leaves things, cleaned, deliberately, with care. First responders noted it immediately. This wasn't a body that had been thrown into the dark and abandoned. Someone had stayed. Someone had taken time, in a remote, freezing clearing, in the middle of December, to arrange a 14-year-old girl as if she were simply resting, as if she might still wake up and go to school in the morning. The autopsy confirmed what the scene had already suggested. Dana had succumbed to severe, blunt force trauma to her head, and the coroner noted she had been subjected to physical violence before her life was taken. And the coroner confirmed something that made everything sharper. She had died on December 14th. The same night, she disappeared. She had never made it past that first evening, 4 days of searching, and she had been here the entire time. There was almost nothing for forensics to work with. Dana's body had been exposed for 4 full days in open winter conditions. Rain, wind, snowfall, temperature drops. The kind of weather that destroys evidence, not preserves it. What remained was 10 strands of hair found on the exterior of her body. That was all the winter wind had left behind. And in 1981, it was nowhere near enough to find a name. From day one, this investigation was already operating in the dark. Lead investigator Jack Lavers was one of the first senior officers to reach the scene. He stood in that clearing and looked at what the killer had left behind. And the thing that struck him first wasn't the violence. It was what came after it. The cleaned face, the arranged clothing, the books tucked under her arm. Lavers called it an element of remorse. The person who did this hadn't simply walked away. They had felt something standing over this girl, guilt, grief, something human enough to make them stop and try to undo what they had done, which opened up questions with no comfortable answers. Was this the killer's first murder? Experienced killers don't linger, they don't arrange, they don't clean faces. And there was a darker possibility. What if the care shown to Dana's body wasn't random guilt? What if the killer knew her? Police made a calculated gamble. They went to the media, appealing directly to the killer's conscience, hoping the heavy silence of the Christmas season would break him open. They waited for the phone to ring. The killer did not come forward. After December 18th, St. John's was a different city. Not loudly different. The streets looked the same, the shops stayed open, Christmas decorations were still strung across the same lampposts. But underneath all of that, in the quiet ways that show up in how people move through the world, everything had shifted. Teenagers who used to hitchhike everywhere stopped. Overnight, parents who had let their kids roam freely started watching the clock. Neighbors who had smiled at each other without a second thought were now looking a little longer, a little harder. Did my neighbor do it? Do I know him? Have I already shaken hands with the man who did this to her? The investigators who had spent 4 days searching for a living girl were now hunting a man who had been among them the whole time. And the detail that Superintendent Lavers himself would admit years later, quietly, with the weight of a man who never fully let it go, was this, somewhere in that investigation. In those hundreds of interviews and those 800 cars and those endless leads, they had probably already looked him in the eye. 4 years of silence. Then, a name. And when police found him, he confessed. But what happened next would become one of the most controversial moments in Canadian criminal history. By 1986, St. John's had learned to live with an open wound. 4 years had passed since Dana disappeared. The task force that had once held 35 investigators had quietly shrunk to a fraction of that. The composite sketch still existed. The file was still open. But the momentum that had carried those first weeks had worn down into something quieter and harder to name. The city had not forgotten. It never forgot. But it had adjusted. And somewhere in St. John's, whoever had killed Dana Bradley had spent 4 years watching the investigation stall, watching the police run out of road, and doing nothing, saying nothing. Then, in early 1986, an anonymous note arrived at the RCMP. It named a man. David Grant Somerton. Somerton had just finished serving 7 years in prison for armed robbery. He was back in St. John's, recently released, carrying a documented history of mental illness and substance abuse. And when investigators looked at the composite sketch the Smeaton brothers had helped create 4 years earlier, the resemblance stopped them cold. Same facial structure, same build, same rough edges around the jaw and eyes. Police brought him in, and David Somerton confessed, not reluctantly, not in pieces. He told them he had killed Dana Bradley. He described the sequence of events. And then he said something that made every investigator in that room go completely still. He told them where the murder weapon was buried. He told them where he had abandoned the car. These were not details that had ever appeared in any newspaper. The RCMP had held them back deliberately, standard practice, precisely so. A genuine confessor could be separated from someone seeking attention. The logic was simple. Only the killer would know these things. And Somerton knew them. He knew things that were never made public. So how did he know, unless he was there? Lavers would later say there were descriptive details in Somerton's confession that he genuinely could not explain. Things that matched what investigators knew, but had never shared publicly. In that room, in early 1986, everyone believed they had their man. For the first time since December 1981, St. John's exhaled. The search that followed was unlike anything Newfoundland had ever seen. Somerton said the murder weapon was buried at Maddox Cove Road. Police descended on the site, trees cleared, frozen ground thawed and excavated section by section. He said he had abandoned the car at the city landfill. Police dug through it week after week, machinery working through garbage and frozen earth. Nothing, no weapon, no car, not one physical object connecting David Somerton to Dana Bradley. By the time the excavations ended, the RCMP had spent close to $1 million. $1 million on 2 holes in the ground that gave them nothing back. And the silence at the bottom of those holes was the loudest thing anyone had heard since the case began. Then Somerton recanted. He withdrew the entire confession. In its place, he offered a different story, one that shifted the conversation from what he had said to how it had been obtained. Somerton said he had been held in an interrogation room for 18 consecutive hours. He had a documented history of mental illness. He said he was at an absolute psychological breaking point inside that room, deteriorating, unraveling, reaching a point where he would have said anything to make it stop. In his own words, "I was on the verge of flipping out. I said, 'Have me charged, or get me out of this room.' And then I started telling them where the car was, where the weapon was. I was doing anything to get them to back off." The murder charge was stayed. Without physical evidence, the case collapsed. He was convicted of public mischief instead, 2 years in prison for wasting police time. But the question that refused to leave the room was this. If he didn't kill Dana, how did he know the details he knew, the ones that had never been made public? There are 2 possible answers, and neither is comfortable. The first, Somerton was telling the truth in the confession and lying in the recantation. He killed Dana and used the interrogation conditions as cover to walk everything back. The second answer is darker. During those early weeks after Dana's murder, police had gone very public with the case. Composite sketch in the newspapers, car descriptions on the radio, case details broadcast repeatedly. What if Somerton had simply absorbed enough from that coverage to construct a convincing confession? What if investigators, desperate after 4 years, heard what they needed to hear and stopped asking whether it was real? The 2004 Lamer Inquiry. A major public investigation into 3 wrongful murder convictions in Newfoundland gave that question teeth. It found a documented pattern of tunnel vision in Newfoundland law enforcement, inexperienced investigators, overwhelmed task forces, a tendency to fix on one suspect and interpret everything through that lens. A system under pressure that sometimes broke in the direction of the answer it wanted, rather than the one that was true. The interrogation transcripts from Somerton's 18 hours in that room have never been made public. David Somerton served his 2 years and walked back out onto the streets of St. John's. He returned to the same city where Dana's family still lived, where the wound was still open. And somewhere else in that city, if Somerton wasn't the killer, another man had just watched the entire thing unfold. He had watched $1 million disappear into 2 empty holes in the ground. He had watched the wrong man go to prison. And then he had gone back to his life, quietly, completely, without saying a word. 33 years had passed. And then a man came forward. He said he was in the car. He said he watched everything. And for a moment, the province finally thought it had its answer. In 2014, a man came forward. He gave himself the pseudonym Robert. He had spent decades trying to outrun the memory of a single evening in December 1981. Years of drinking had kept the images blurred and distant. Then he got sober, and everything came back. Robert said he was 6 years old on December 14, 1981. His 4-year-old brother was with him. They were in the back seat of a car driven by a man their family knew. A neighbor, someone their father trusted. The car belonged to Robert's father. Robert said he remembered the cold, the seat, the engine noise, and he remembered the moment the car slowed down on Topsail Road. A girl was walking along the shoulder of the road, thumb out. The car pulled over. She tried the passenger door. The handle didn't work from the outside. The driver leaned across and pushed it open from inside. She got in. She closed the door. And then she turned around. She saw the boys in the back seat. Robert said she smiled at them. She asked what grade they were in. His brother was quiet, too young, too shy. Robert answered for him. Just 2 kids in the back of a car, going wherever the adults were going. Nothing unusual about that in 1981 St. John's. She gave the driver her address, Patrick Street. He nodded. The car moved, but it didn't turn toward Patrick Street. Robert said he noticed it without fully understanding it, the way children notice things that feel wrong before they have words for it. The car was going the wrong way. Away from the city, away from lights and people. Dana noticed too. She became frightened quickly. She asked where they were going. The driver didn't answer. And then she reached for the door handle. It didn't work from the inside either. She tried again, harder. The man reached back and grabbed her, pulled her back into the seat. She fought. She kept reaching, kept pulling, kept trying to find a way out of a car that was taking her somewhere she didn't want to go. Robert watched all of this from the back seat. 6 years old. His brother pressed against him. Neither of them making a sound. The car eventually stopped. A wooded area. Dark. Far enough from the road that there was nothing around them. The driver turned violent, but Dana fought back fiercely, scratching his face hard enough to make him pull away for a crucial moment. That scratch gave her a second. She got the door open, and she ran. Robert said he got out of the car. He stood in the dark and he watched. He watched the man catch her. He watched what happened next, and he watched the man pick up a tire iron and bring it down. Dana Bradley did not get up. Robert said the man put her body in the trunk and drove to Maddox Cove Road. And then Robert said something that reframed the entire crime scene. The detail that had puzzled investigators since December 18th, the cleaned face, the arranged clothing, the school books tucked carefully under her arm. Robert said it wasn't the killer who arranged her. It was him. A 6-year-old boy standing in a freezing clearing, crying over a girl he had met 20 minutes earlier. He said he placed the books under her arm because he thought it might help. He thought if she looked like she was going to school, maybe she would be okay in the morning. He was 6 years old. That was the only logic he had. When Robert's story was published in the Telegram in 2014, it detonated across Newfoundland. Former lead investigator Jack Lavers believed it deserved serious investigation. He said so publicly. The named suspect, a man from Witless Bay, whom Robert called a family friend, was a convicted pedophile who had never once appeared on the RCMP's radar in connection with Dana's case. The community erupted. A Facebook page, crowdfunding. Public pressure on the RCMP to act. For a brief, electric moment, it felt like the truth had finally surfaced after 33 years. But the RCMP had spent 16 months testing every detail of Robert's story against what they actually knew. And what they found dismantled it entirely. The injuries Robert described didn't match Dana's actual injuries. The clothing details were wrong. Some items he mentioned didn't exist. The position of her body contradicted what officers had documented at the scene. And as Robert spoke to more people and read more articles, his story kept changing, growing more specific, absorbing details from media coverage, including details the media had gotten wrong. The named suspect was DNA tested. He didn't match. Robert's account was, in that single result, scientifically closed. And St. John sat with the wreckage of a second false answer, quieter this time, more exhausted, less surprised. Dana Bradley's real killer had survived another storm. Somewhere, he had watched a child's recovered memory come within reach of exposing him. And then he watched it fall apart too. May 2016. 35 years after Dana Bradley walked away from her friend's house and never came home, the RCMP called a press conference, and for the first time in 3.5 decades, they had something real to say. Before we get to that press conference, we need to go back to what was happening in St. John's that same spring. Robert's story had collapsed, but the public pressure it had generated hadn't. Terry Hines, who had organized the Justice for Dana Bradley Facebook page and a lawsuit against the RCMP, had taken the fight all the way to a privately funded excavation. When the courts didn't move fast enough, he stopped waiting. 3 days after the RCMP's press conference, Hines and a group of supporters dug up 2 vehicles buried on private property in the Witless Bay area. Crowd-funded shovels, volunteers in work boots, 2 cars pulled from 30 years of frozen earth, a moment that felt, to everyone watching, like it might finally be the answer. It wasn't. The cars were unrecognizable. 30 years of soil pressure, sewage contamination, and chemical erosion had reduced them to hollow shells. Nothing to test. Nothing that connected them to Dana or to anyone else. Terry Hines said it was a real letdown. The kind of disappointment that doesn't just hurt you, it hollows you out. He never fully recovered from it. He died in 2019, without an answer, still carrying the weight of a case that had consumed the last years of his life. But here is what was happening at exactly the same time. While the volunteers were digging in Witless Bay, the RCMP was announcing something that had nothing to do with Robert, nothing to do with Thomas Carey, and nothing to do with any named suspect. They had gone back to 1981. Specifically, they had gone back to those 10 strands of hair recovered from Dana's body in that clearing off Maddox Cove Road. Hair that had sat in an evidence locker for 35 years while the science needed to process it slowly, caught up to what it was. In 2016, that science was finally there. Forensic scientists retested the sample using methods that didn't exist when Dana was killed. And this time, they extracted something. A complete male DNA profile. Biological material left behind by a man who had been in that clearing in December 1981. Not Dana's DNA. Not a first responder's. A profile that pointed, clearly and scientifically, to an unknown male. Pat Cahill, who led the RCMP's Major Crimes Division, called it a significant breakthrough. And it was, because this was not a confession that could be recanted, not a recovered memory that could be disputed, not a theory or a composite sketch. It was biology. The killer's own cells, preserved by cold and evidence packaging through 35 winters, finally speaking in a language science could read. They had his biological signature, locked, preserved, waiting. For the first time since 1981, police held something the killer could not take back. The profile did not match anyone in the existing databases. And by 2026, investigators confirmed that the specific contributor identified in 2016 had been ruled out of direct involvement in Dana's murder. But here is what that does not mean. It does not mean the biological evidence is exhausted. It does not mean science has run out of road. Investigative genetic genealogy, the same technology that has cracked 40- and 50-year-old cold cases across North America, works differently from standard DNA matching. It doesn't need the killer to be in a criminal database. It traces outward, through family trees, through distant cousins, through ancestry platforms, through ordinary people who swab their cheeks for ethnicity results, and unknowingly hand investigators a thread that leads back through generations to a single man. This technology has identified killers who died decades ago. It has found answers in cases where every traditional lead had failed, and it is now being applied to cold cases exactly like Dana's, cases with preserved biological material and no database match. The hair strands in that evidence locker are not a dead end. They are a starting point that 1981 science simply wasn't equipped to follow. What remains in the present is a city that has never let this go. St. John's is still small, 100,000 people on an island at the edge of the Atlantic, where everyone is connected to everyone else by 2 or 3 degrees. That closeness means something in a case like this. The killer, if he is still alive, probably never left. He has likely spent 45 Decembers in the same province as the family he destroyed. 45 times watching Christmas trees appear on Topsail Road. 45 times seeing Dana's name in the newspaper. 45 years of ordinary life. Groceries, grandchildren, Sunday mornings, built on top of what he did in that clearing. Doug Murdoch, who grew up near Dana and went to the same school, says every December it comes back. Not as a distant memory, as something immediate and sharp. Martina Hines, Terry's daughter, is now studying criminology at Memorial University. She says if 45 years haven't produced an answer, someone new needs to look at the evidence with fresh eyes. Mike Heffernan has spent years writing a book about this case, working through primary sources and police files. He is not just asking who killed Dana. He is asking what institutional failures allowed the real killer to remain free for this long. It is a question the province has never fully answered. Dana Bradley's school books are still in an RCMP evidence locker in St. John's, the same ones she picked up when she said goodbye to her friends on Curry Place. The same ones found tucked under her arm in that clearing 4 days later. They have been there for 45 years, tagged, sealed, waiting. She should have been a grandmother by now. She should have had a full life. Art, ordinary Decembers, the quiet happiness that 14-year-olds don't yet know they're going to want. That life was taken on a 5-minute walk, by a man whose name we still do not know. Somewhere in Newfoundland, maybe still breathing, maybe long gone, that man knows exactly what happened on Topsail Road that December evening. He knows what Dana's face looked like when she realized where the car was going. He knows what she said. He knows how hard she fought. He knows what the clearing felt like afterward. And for 45 years, through every confession and every witness and every press conference and every headline, he has never said a word. Dana Bradley deserves an answer. Her family deserves an answer. And after 45 years, so does the city that has carried her memory in its bones. Today, in 2026, the file remains open at the RCMP detachment in St. John's. The technology will keep moving forward. The genetic searches will continue, tracing back through family trees and distant cousins until that single strand of hair finds its match. Science does not forget. And neither will Newfoundland. The man who took her life has managed to outrun the law for nearly half a century. He has hidden behind the silence of a small town, behind the mistakes of old investigations, and behind the passage of time itself. But time is running out. If you have ever carried a secret from that December in 1981, if you have ever looked at someone you know and wondered, now is the time to speak. Because 45 years of silence is long enough.